Hello again, friends. This is Jeffery Donaldson offering another Jeweler's Eye reading of a new poem by a Canadian poet. This time around, I've chosen a poem from John Reibetanz's fine new book entitled Afloat, published by Brick Books, 2013. And the poem that we're going to take a look at is entitled The Vineyard. How long will it take, when my body is stored in the cask of the earth, for hands to offer up the bone and muscle of grasp and fist, and become the undulating, light-filled, fine-veined hands of vine leaves? How long for the backbone's steel shaft to soften into a questioning whisper, coiling and resting on whatever support the earth comes up with? How many tides for thought to purge itself of edge and corner, and be poured into the sea-polished roundness of the grape's sweet flesh? And how long before blood, shuttling through its tunnels, becomes this unbound flowering, this blushing face that needs no mirror because it is one, giving the world, dyed into rose heart, and rising as the scent of morning. So this is a poem about a vineyard. Nature is going to serve as symbol, as metaphor for aspects of human nature, aspects of human mind and desire. This is about a vineyard where certain processes are unfolding, but it is a articulated nature, if you like. Actually, I rather like that idea of an articulated nature in the way that vine leaves in a vineyard are actually wrapped around their supports and run out in long lines, as though the field itself were providing us with something like a poetic form of lines run out here in triplets or tercets, and in their long-lined articulations transforming themselves into something else. So this is a 12-line poem dividing into 4 unrhyming tercets. And as it happens, the syntax of the argument, if you like, breaks down into 4 stages as well, each of them presented in the form of a question. We could get some work done just with the notion of the poem as a question-asking exercise. The curious feature of this particular vineyard is that it is also serving as a burial place, and this whole context of the deceased human body being buried in an environment that transforms it into something sweeter, into something more than itself. I can't help but think of Walt Whitman's This Compost, a poem about the marvelous capacity of the earth to turn what decays into new growth. Whitman's poem, like Reibetanz's, hints at the spiritual meaning of this very material process, finding divinity in actual chemical processes. But yes, the main theme of the Whitman poem of taking a death, taking what ends, and composting it, turning it into new growth, comes back to us in Reibetanz's poem in the form of a speaking voice asking this very question about itself in the context of a very particular kind of environment where sweet things are actually grown from what comes to an end in the soil beneath. So 4 questions are asked in the poem. How long will it take? How long for the backbone's steel shaft? How many tides for thought? And finally, how long before blood? These questions of how long implicate desire, waiting, kind of forward dawning into the future. So that this is a poem of becoming, and there's an irony here, of course, in the fact that this becoming becomes after one ends, that is, after death. We are quite literally beyond ourselves when we die, of course, this sense of a material transformation. And this might be as good a place as any to be thinking about how poems themselves are often self-reflexively inquiring into their own abilities to compost their own materials and turn them into something else. Poems are, in a sense, a wriggling from themselves. Every word is a record of its own reaching past what it cannot say. And so in the actual syntax of the poem, we get this sense of initiating a process in the form of a question It initiates that process but does not complete it, not to answer the question, but to intensify it by asking it in other words. In effect, its own scrabbling after transformation, its own exploration of the possibility of moving more deeply towards an understanding of what kind of transformation we might hope for by intensifying the questions that we can ask around it. So let's slow down here and look at each of these questions in isolation. How long will it take when my body is stored in the cask of the earth for hands to offer up the bone and muscle of grasp and fist and become the undulating, light-filled, fine-veined hands of vine leaves? Nice punning, of course. This notion of the earth itself as a cask, picking up the bodies themselves are buried or stored, as here, in caskets. But the casket becomes a cask, that is, the container, not the holder of a deceased body, but the storer of something yet to be enjoyed. Notice then that in each of these cases, as in this first instance, there is a physical property of the individual body that passes through or into an alternate state by this natural process. When my body is stored in the cask of the earth, how long will it take for hands to offer up the bone and muscle of grasp and fist? In each case, Reibetanz emphasizes a particular human ability, a particular human capacity that is itself transformed. And so here it's the bone and muscle of grasp and fist, the metaphors of labor and of work, this metaphor of fisted labor, if you like, becoming something more relaxed, more open, the undulating, light-filled, fine-veined hands of vine leaves. Look how beautifully interwoven these words are. Light-filled, fine-veined. The vine of vine leaves picks up fine-veined, F-I-N-E-V-I-N-E, fine vine, but vein, fine-veined vine leaves, vein in vine as well. It's almost as though fine-veined collapses into just vine, but also light-filled, fine-veined hands of vine leaves, light-filled vine leaves, the leaves and light sort of answering to one another, and all of this, of course, creating a rather beautiful undulating effect in the actual sound of the line, this feeling of sounds washing over one another in smoothed waves. This transformation of labor into mere being, into the open expression and revelation, the showing forth of fine-veined hands of vine leaves. So there's this beautiful sense in the transformation of the hand itself letting go of its own abilities to grasp and now become merely an expression of what it is opening into. How beautiful is that? And Reibetanz continues in a similar form. How long for the backbone steel shaft to soften into a questioning whisper, coiling and resting on whatever support the earth comes up with? We can see how the notion of support is inverted. The backbone steel shaft, which has done all of the supporting, will soften, coiling and resting on whatever support the earth comes up with. Nice little nuanced phrase there, resting on whatever support the earth comes up with. So this sense of the earth coming up with this makeshift, improvised, casual ground, which of course it is anything but. Oh, I just happen to have this ground for you to rest on. That sense of the earth comes up with. But then also, of course, the lovely vertical metaphor that is at work there. The backbone steel shaft will rest on. That is, there is a sense of the body reclining into something that is rising up. So again, this transformation of a human capacity into an earthly capacity that it gives itself over into. And so further, how many tides for thought to purge itself of edge and corner and be poured into the sea-polished roundness of the grape's sweet flesh? Do we have the four elements here? Is this worth trying on? We have a transformation into light, that is, we have air in the first tercet, then we have earth in the second. Then with the next question, we have water, how many tides for thought, and then perhaps something of fire. We'll come to that in a minute in the fourth tercet, but we may be finding the four elements at work here in a quiet way. But yes, in the third tercet, the sense of thought's own limitations purging themselves, so thought being released from limits, from borders, edges and corners, and becoming liquid, pouring into sea-polished roundness of the grape's sweet flesh. And we can think about how nicely nuanced the opposition is between edge and corner, poured into the sea-polished roundness, a circularity, a forming around a sweet flesh rather than the crashing against edge and corner. And then finally, the metaphor that we might have expected from such a poem of transformations in a vineyard, the metaphor of blood itself as a form of wine. Although curiously, wine is the one substance that isn't actually named in the poem, which makes blood an eligible tacit surrogate for it. At how long before blood, shuttling through its tunnels, becomes this unbound flowering, this blushing face. We have movement and motion, a passing through already, the blood already in circulation in the body, but here shuttling through its tunnels with the suggestion of a shuttling back and forth on a kind of workaday passing through familiar limits, shuttling through its tunnels, becoming this unbound flowering. This phrase possibly the moment of intensest clarification or of arrival. So the blood no longer passing through channels, but opening up into an end, that is, the expression of a flower. And it is interesting, isn't it, that our blood passes through our veins around and around, and only flowers in the sense that in every round, in every circulation cycle, it passes into and through your rose-colored heart. But here, passing from this shuttling into its end, its ultimate expression in something that is more than just the shuttling through its tunnels. And so what is this unbound flowering, this blushing face that needs no mirror because it is one, giving the world, dyed into rose heart and rising as the scent of morning. Of course, in our lives, blood could be thought of as flowering into a blushing face, and we look into the mirror to see it. But here, this blushing face, this unbound flowering, requires no mirror because it is one. It's a mirror in a variety of senses. A rose, as we come to learn the flower might be in the final line, is a self-mirroring, each petal, as it were, reflecting each of the others. But of course the flower itself becomes a metaphor for and a mirror of the blood that has flowered into it. And so such a flower requires no mirror because it is a mirror. It is this transforming process coming clear as itself, mirroring and fulfilling all that has passed into it, right? This clear revelation of a thing to itself is a giving of the world to the world, not the kind of grasping and moving of things that we began the poem with, but the giving forth of itself to itself. And how perfect is that, right? Giving the world the world. The world is mirrored in the world. The world doesn't require a mirror because it is one. And then this beautiful last line, the poem trying, as it were, to flower into its own promise, giving the world, dyed into rose heart and rising as the scent of morning. Wonderful punning, of course, with the dyeing of the color red, the rose being dyed, but also the human body dying into its expression in this new transformed symbol of itself. So I think the rose heart is the poem's own unbound flowering into itself. And I'm hearing a number of different possible resonances in the phrase, just in the plain material sense that a rose is rather heart-like. And so the blood dying into the rose heart is the blood returning, as it does in our bodies, the blood returning to a heart, this time a rose heart, to be refreshed and sent out again. So the circulation of the blood passing through its tunnels, finally achieving and returning to its refreshment in something beyond itself, now a rising above the object itself in the form of a fragrance. how sweetly conceived that is in the poem. But a couple of possible echoes as well in this idea of the rose heart. W.B. Yeats has a poem from his book The Wind in the Reeds entitled The Lover Tells of the Rose in His Heart. Reibetanz's poem seems to share with Yeats's example this sense of human entropy finding its answer in a growing at the depths of the heart, a blossoming there, blossoms a rose in the deeps of my heart. But knowing Rainer Maria Rilke's own epitaph in the Mitchell translation, Rose, O pure contradiction, joy of being no one's, sleep under so many lids, this beautiful realization of the rose itself as an image of a flowering into death, also involving mirrors, also involving this self-fulfilling expression of a thing that is no longer oneself. One would want to add to this echoic pair T.S. Eliot's close to the end of 4 quartets. I'd asked the question earlier, is there an idea of the element of fire working in this last tercet? Certainly blood associated with passion and fire quietly at work there, but surely also in the echo of T.S. Eliot's closing to Little Gidding, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well, when the tongues of flame are infolded into the crowned knot of fire, and the fire and the rose are one. So here Reibetanz possibly echoing a poem where fire and rose become versions of one another, clearing the way for a transformation into a thing that is simply itself, so that rose heart now becomes a marrying of a variety of possible resonances that it is itself the fulfillment of. And it's a rather nice idea to think of echo itself as a form of transformation. That is, the examples of these high modernists, Rilke, Eliot, and Yeats, undergoing a transformation themselves and dying, that is, the words echoically passing into a later poem that is not them, but in which they are potentially fulfilled insofar as their own words find a fulfilling expression there. Poetic echo itself as a form of unbound flowering. And so we can finish by thinking again about the question form that the poem takes. How long will it take? Well, the poem itself takes 12 lines and gives us 4 different versions of this transformation. And so in some sense we know exactly how long it will take. It will take 12 lines. And it might in that sense be worth noticing that the final question ends with a period and not with a question. And yet there are those questions that wriggle themselves into something more than just a question in their own asking. And this question, in a sense, goes on so long. How long will it take? This question goes on so long that one forgets that it is a question, which allows the undulating lines to rise into their indicative, as it were, into statement, into simple revelation, rather than an asking, rather than a reaching towards. How beautifully the poem manages that. Insofar as this is a poem of spiritual concern and the possibility of a spiritual transformation, the forms of body and mind finding their promise in alternate forms. We might hear in the questions of how long an echo of Psalm 13 of the Bible, here in the King James Version, how long wilt thou forget me, O Lord, forever? How long wilt thou hide thy face from me? How long shall I take counsel in my soul? How long shall mine enemy be exalted over me? The 4 questions at the opening of Psalm 13 finding its own transformation in the 4 questions that Reibetanz asks in a more secularized but nonetheless still very spiritual expression. And again, insofar as this is a poem that echoes and revitalizes questions and our ways of asking them, rather than final answers, the question asking itself becomes a form of patience, of endurance. And I rather like the idea of echoic conversations unfolding between poems as being themselves a form of patience, of an enduring, as the original lines wait to find their expression in a new form. So the later echoing poem then might be thought of as the fulfillment of that promise, the wriggling of words into new forms that receive them and carry them forward, very much in the manner that the Vineyard itself does in this beautiful piece. So there we have it. That is John Reibetanz's poem, The Vineyard, and you'll find it in his fine new volume entitled Afloat, published by Brick Books, 2013.